The summer air clung to me like a second skin, heavy with humidity and the smoky tang of grilling burgers. I stood on the porch of our weathered family home, the kind with peeling paint and creaky steps that hadn't seen a fresh coat since Dad remarried. Down in the yard, the neighborhood barbecue was in full swing, laughter mingled with the twang of classic rock, Skynyrd maybe, or Creedence, blaring from a portable speaker perched on a picnic table. String lights swayed in the faint breeze, their golden glow flickering over the chaos of neighbors milling about, paper plates in hand, beers sweating in the heat. I tugged at the hem of my sundress, a pale yellow number I'd borrowed from my friend Carol. It wasn't my usual style, jeans and a tee were more my speed, but she'd insisted it was perfect for tonight. "Live a little, Grace," she'd said, tossing it at me with a wink. The fabric hugged my hips, dipping low enough to feel daring, and I couldn't shake the sense that every eye in the yard might notice. I'd come with a few gals from my book club, promising myself I'd shed the quiet shell I'd worn since high school, but they'd vanished into the crowd 10 minutes after we arrived. Now I stood alone, clutching a soda can that had gone warm, the fizz long dead, watching folks sway and stumble to the beat. "What's a beauty like you doing all alone?" The voice cut through the noise, deep and rough around the edges, like gravel under boots. I turned, nearly dropping my drink, and there he was, Lucas, my stepbrother, leaning against the porch railing. His sandy hair was mussed, sticking up in that careless way that made him look like he'd just rolled out of bed, and his green eyes glinted with mischief under the dim light. He wore a faded flannel, sleeves rolled to his elbows, showing off forearms tanned from working odd jobs around town. Handsome didn't quite cover it. He had that rugged charm that drew folks in, whether they liked it or not. We'd been family for 3 years, ever since Mom married his dad and merged our lives into this odd little unit. Lucas was everything I wasn't. Loud, reckless, the kind of guy who'd start a fight just to finish it grinning. Me? I kept to myself, nose in a book or tending the garden out back, but there was always something between us, a thread I couldn't cut. We'd bicker over the remote, trade jabs over breakfast, and sometimes, in the quiet, I'd catch him looking at me a beat too long, his smirk softening into something I couldn't name. "Hey, Lucas," I said, my voice barely carrying over the thump of the bass. "Shouldn't you be flirting with someone your own age?" I tipped my head toward the yard, where a gaggle of women hovered near the grill, giggling over their solo cups. He laughed, a low rumble that sent a shiver through me despite the heat. "Age is just a number, Grace. Besides..." He stepped closer, close enough that I caught the scent of cedar cologne clinging to his shirt, sharp and warm. I heard this barbecue had the best company, had to see for myself. I rolled my eyes, but my pulse kicked up a notch. The lights caught the angles of his face, sharpening that jawline I'd studied more times than I'd admit. Up close, with his hair falling over his brow and that grin tugging at his lips, he looked too much like trouble, and not the kind I knew how to handle. A couple of guys staggered by, their voices slurring over the music. "Hey, Lucas, who's your girl? She's a keeper," one hollered, raising his beer in a sloppy toast. Before I could protest, Lucas's arm slid around my waist, pulling me against his side. His grip was firm, warm through the thin fabric of my dress, and I felt my breath hitch. "Been telling her that all night," he called back, his tone mock-offended. "But she's too stubborn to listen." The group roared, one shoving Lucas playfully, nearly splashing beer on my shoes. "Get a room, you two," another yelled, and they stumbled off, cackling. My cheeks burned, bright enough to rival the string lights. "Ignore them," Lucas said, his voice dropping low, too close to my ear. His breath tickled my skin, and I couldn't miss the heat radiating from where his hand rested on my hip. "They're drunk, always talking nonsense." I glanced up at him, our eyes locking for a split second before I looked away, my soda can denting under my grip. "They're not wrong about the stubborn part," I muttered, half teasing, half testing. His fingers tightened briefly, and I wondered if he felt the same jolt I did, the kind that made me question why I didn't pull away. The night stretched on, the barbecue buzzing around us, but I couldn't shake the weight of his arm, the way it felt less like a joke and more like a promise. Maybe it was the heat, or the music, or the way the lights danced in his eyes, but something was shifting, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. The barbecue's hum faded as Lucas led me toward his old pickup truck parked down the street, its chipped red paint glinting under a flickering street lamp. The night air buzzed with cicadas, thick and warm, pressing against my skin as I slid onto the passenger seat. The leather was hot from the day's sun, sticking to the backs of my thighs where the sundress didn't cover. Lucas climbed in beside me, slamming the door with a thud that echoed in the quiet. The dashboard glowed soft amber, casting shadows across his face, sharp jawline, a faint stubble catching the light. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the seat. "Couldn't let you walk home in that dress," he said, glancing my way as he pulled onto the road. His voice carried that rough edge I'd come to know, teasing but laced with something heavier. I shifted, the hem of my dress riding up just enough to bear an extra inch of skin. His eyes flicked down, quick as a heartbeat, then back to the windshield. I saw his hands tighten on the wheel, knuckles paling against the cracked leather. "Worried about me, huh?" I tilted my head, letting my fingers drift to my knee. They moved slow, tracing a lazy circle over my skin, the motion deliberate, testing. The air in the cab thickened, charged with the hum of the engine, and something unspoken. "Didn't think you'd notice." He let out a low chuckle, almost a growl. "Hard not to, Grace. You're trouble tonight." His gaze darted to me again, lingering this time on the stretch of my legs, glowing in the dashboard light. The truck hit a bump, jostling us, and my hand slid higher, brushing the edge of my thigh. I caught the twitch in his jaw, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Trouble's only fun if you play along," I said, my voice dropping to a purr. I leaned closer, my shoulder brushing his, my hair spilling forward to graze his arm. The scent of his cologne, cedar, and a hint of sweat, mixed with the leather, pulling me in. "You're not as steady as you think, Lucas." He exhaled hard, his breath warm against my cheek. "Maybe not with you looking like that." The words came out gruff, unguarded, and I felt a thrill ripple through me, sharp and wild. The road stretched dark ahead, lined with swaying pines, but inside the cab, it was just us, two sparks waiting to catch. I turned my head, our faces inches apart now. My lips parted, hovering near his, close enough to feel the heat of him. "Prove it," I whispered, the challenge hanging between us. Then I moved, quick and soft, letting my lips graze his. A fleeting touch, barely a kiss, but it lit me up like a match to dry grass. His breath hitched, loud in the tight space, and I pulled back just enough to see his eyes darken, pupils wide and hungry. "Grace." His voice cracked, rougher than before. He reached out, his hand hovering over my arm, fingers flexing like he wanted to grab me but didn't trust himself. The truck slowed as he eased off the gas, tires crunching over gravel on the shoulder. "You don't know what you're starting." "Don't I?" I held his stare, my hand still resting on my thigh, fingers paused mid-motion. My heart pounded, loud enough I swore he could hear it over the engine's idle. The air felt alive, electric, every breath a dare. I wanted to push him, to see how far that steady facade could bend before it broke. He shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're gonna be the death of me." His hand dropped to the gear shift, shifting us back into motion, but the tension didn't ease. It coiled tighter, wrapping around us like the night itself. The graze of our lips lingered on mine, a taste of something I couldn't unfeel, and I knew he felt it too. As we rolled toward home, the headlights cutting through the dark, I settled back against the seat, my skin buzzing. The yellow dress clung to me, creased and warm, and I let my fingers rest where they'd stopped, a quiet promise to myself. Whatever this was, reckless, forbidden, alive, it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I stumbled into the kitchen, my head throbbing like a drumbeat echoing last night's chaos. The barbecue's buzz still clung to me, smoke in my hair, a faint ache behind my eyes. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, glinting off the chipped linoleum, and there was Lucas, leaning against the counter. He wore a plain white tee, damp from a shower, his hair curling at the ends where water hadn't dried. The air smelled of coffee, rich and dark, mingling with the clean pine scent that rolled off him. He slid a mug across the counter without a word, steam curling up like a question. "Thanks," I croaked, wrapping my hands around the ceramic. It was warm against my palms, and that first sip hit like a lifeline, bitter and smooth, washing away the fog. I glanced at him over the rim, catching the way his eyes lingered on me, steady, unreadable, but sharp enough to make my fingers tighten. "You look rested," he said, a smirk tugging at his mouth, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. He crossed his arms, the fabric stretching over his chest, and I felt the air shift, heavy with what we weren't saying. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, suddenly aware of the thin tank top I'd thrown on, no bra underneath. "It was a good night, don't you think?" My voice came out bolder than I felt, inviting him to step into the memory of that truck, that kiss. His eyes narrowed, a flash of heat cutting through the green before he turned to pour himself more coffee. "Yeah," he muttered, 4 syllables that carried the weight of everything we'd danced around. It was. That was it for words that morning, but I wasn't done. Over the next few days, I turned it into a game, one he couldn't ignore. I shed my usual layers, trading jeans for shorts that barely skimmed my thighs, the kind that showed off every curve when I moved. Tank tops replaced my old tees, thin enough that the outline of my breasts peeked through when the light hit just right. I'd catch him watching, quick glances he'd try to hide, and it lit something reckless in me. One afternoon, sprawled on the living room couch, I stretched slow and deliberate, arms overhead, letting the tank ride up. The hem lifted, bearing a strip of skin above my waistband, smooth and tanned from the summer sun. Lucas sat across from me, flipping through a car magazine, but his grip on the pages tightened, knuckles white. I swung my legs off the cushion and sauntered to the fridge, bending low to grab a water bottle. The shorts hugged me, and I lingered there, feeling his eyes burn into my back. He cleared his throat, loud enough to break the silence. "You're making it hard to focus, Grace," he said, voice rough, like he'd been holding it in too long. I shut the fridge door slow, turning to face him with a smirk. "Good thing I'm not trying to help." Our eyes locked, mine sparking with a challenge I didn't need to voice. He shifted on the couch, jaw tight, but didn't look away. Not this time. Another day, I came in from the store, arms full of grocery bags. Lucas lounged on the sofa, remote in hand, the TV droning some old western. I set the bags on the counter, my tank top slipping up as I reached to unpack. The air was cool against my stomach, and I felt his gaze snag there, tracing the line of bare skin before darting back to the screen. "Need some help?" I asked, leaning a hip against the counter, letting my shorts ride high enough to show the length of my legs. He flicked the TV off, a flush creeping up his neck. "Nah, I'm good." His voice was tight, clipped. "Nice to see you home, though. You're always out with those book club girls." Was that an edge of jealousy? I stepped closer, narrowing the gap between us. "It's my day off from them," I said, letting my tone dip low, teasing. His eyes roamed over me, snagging on my legs, my hips, before he tore them away, staring hard at the wall. "Just don't overwork yourself helping me," he shot back, a half joke to cut the tension. But it hung there electric. I laughed soft, brushing past him toward the stairs, my hand grazing his arm. The touch was light, innocent, but it sparked through us both, a current I couldn't ignore. His breath caught, and as I climbed the steps, I heard the shower kick on behind me, rushing water, like he needed to drown out whatever I'd stirred up. I paused at the landing, a grin tugging at my lips. The game was mine to play now, each move pulling him closer to the edge. The sundress from the barbecue hung in my closet, creased and waiting, but I didn't need it anymore. This was about more than a night. It was about power, about wanting, and I wasn't letting go. Not yet. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the house, when I heard the shower hiss to life upstairs. The sound pulled me like a thread, steady and insistent, cutting through the quiet hum of the old AC unit. Steam slipped under the bathroom door as I padded up the carpeted stairs, barefoot, my pulse quickening with every step. The air grew thick, warm, laced with the sharp, woodsy scent of Lucas's soap. Pine and something deeper, like earth after rain. I smoothed my hair, still damp from the day's humidity, and stopped outside the door, feeling the heat seep into my skin. I pushed it open, slow and deliberate, stepping into a haze of steam that curled around me like a whisper. Lucas's silhouette loomed behind the glass, broad shoulders and lean muscles slick with water. He jolted, a sharp, "Grace, what the?" spilling out as he turned, one hand braced against the tiled wall. The spray cascaded over him, droplets tracing paths down his chest, his stomach, disappearing into the shadows below. His hair clung to his forehead, dark and dripping, and those green eyes locked onto mine, wide with surprise. I leaned against the sink, the cool porcelain biting into my hips through my thin shorts. "Just offering my help if you need it," I said, my voice low, curling through the steam like smoke. A chuckle slipped out, sinuous and deliberate, meant to tug at him. His gaze raked over me, taking in the tank top clinging to my frame, the way my legs stretched bare and golden against the dim light filtering through the fogged window. His body tensed, water streaming over the hard lines of his shoulders, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. "You couldn't wait till I'm out?" he growled, but the roughness in his tone didn't match the way his eyes lingered, dark and heavy. The shower's steady beat filled the silence, a rhythm that matched the thudding in my chest. I stepped closer, the air between us shrinking, thick with heat and something sharper. I tilted my head, letting my hair fall over one shoulder. "I think you're well aware I couldn't wait any longer, Lucas." My voice dipped, husky, mirroring the intent I felt coiling inside me. His eyes darkened, pupils swallowing the green, and for a moment neither of us moved. The steam wrapped around us, clinging to my skin, and I could feel the warmth radiating off him, even through the glass. He cleared his throat, breaking the spell, his hand twitching toward the shower knob. "We shouldn't. This is crazy. We're step-siblings," I finished for him, taking another step, close enough now that the mist brushed my face. My eyes held his, unflinching, savoring the heat pulsing from his body. "But we're also adults, Lucas. Don't you wonder what it'd be like?" His eyes fluttered shut, like he could block me out, block the pull I knew he felt too. Water sluiced over his jaw, his neck, and when he spoke, his voice was gruff, strained. "You know I've wondered. Every damn day." He opened his eyes, pinning me with a look that burned through the haze, raw, conflicted, wanting. I smiled, small and sharp, and leaned in just enough that my breath mingled with the steam. "Then why fight it?" My fingers twitched at my side, itching to reach out, but I held back, letting the question hang. His hand lifted, trembling, hovering near my arm like he might push me away or pull me closer. "This shouldn't happen," he whispered, the words barely audible over the water's rush. His fingers flexed, then dropped, curling into a fist against the glass. I saw the war in his face, the way his chest rose and fell too fast, betraying what his mouth wouldn't say. "Maybe it shouldn't," I murmured, my lips so close I could have brushed his if I wanted. "But what if we can't stop?" I held his gaze a beat longer, then stepped back, the spray breaking the thread between us. The air shifted, cooler against my skin as I reached for the door handle, steam clinging to me like a second skin. "Grace, wait!" His voice cracked, hoarse, a mix of relief and longing chasing me as I turned the knob. I paused, hand lingering, but didn't look back. "I understand," I said, my voice steady despite the storm twisting inside me. "But I won't pretend it's not mutual, Lucas. If you can't resist anymore, don't expect me to." I slipped out, the door clicking shut behind me, leaving him in the steam and the weight of what I'd laid bare. My heart pounded, a wild mix of fear and fire, and as I padded down the hall, I knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't unsee. The house was still as I crept down the corridor, the antique clock in the hall ticking past 1 a.m. Moonlight spilled through the windows, silver and cold, brushing the floorboards beneath my bare feet. My silk nightgown whispered against my thighs, soft and thin, clinging to me as a cool breeze slipped through Lucas's cracked bedroom door. I stopped there, my breath catching, the faint scent of his cologne, cedar and a trace of musk, drifting out to meet me. My heart hammered, loud in the quiet, and I pushed the door open, hinges creaking faintly. Lucas lay on his side, the sheets tangled around his hips, his bare chest rising and falling slow and steady. The moonlight painted him in sharp contrasts: broad shoulders, the dip of his collarbone, his sandy hair mussed across his forehead. He looked softer in sleep, the hard edges of his grin smoothed away. I whispered his name, Lucas. Barely a sound, and his eyes flickered open, green startlingly bright in the dim glow. Grace? Surprise roughened his voice, but he didn't move, just rolled onto his back, arms folding behind his head. What's the matter? I hesitated at the foot of the bed, fingers twisting the hem of my nightgown, the fabric cool against my skin. Couldn't sleep, I said, the words a flimsy shield for what I really meant. His gaze flicked over me, tracing the outline of my legs where the moonlight caught them, and I saw the shift in his eyes, resignation mixing with something eager, pulling me in. Come on, then, he said, patting the bed beside him. His voice was low, steady, but the way his chest tightened gave him away. I slid onto the mattress, the sheets still warm from his body, his scent wrapping around me, spicy, masculine, dizzying. My knee brushed his thigh as I settled, and the air crackled, sharp and alive. You know, Grace, he started, his tone softer now, we can talk about anything on your mind. His eyes locked on mine, heavy with questions neither of us had voiced. My hand moved before I could stop it, finding his, our fingers lacing together in a way that felt too familiar, too charged. Not everything said with words, Lucas, I murmured. The silence stretched, filled with the uneven rhythm of our breathing, growing heavier by the second. I leaned in slow, deliberate, my lips brushing his, a soft, fleeting caress that sent a shiver through him. His breath hitched, loud in the quiet, and when I pulled back, my hand slipped under the sheet, seeking the heat I'd felt simmering all day. Grace, you don't... he gasped, cutting off as my fingers closed around him, firm and slow. His body tensed, arching into my touch, a sharp intake of breath betraying the jolt I'd sparked. I started a rhythm, torturous and steady, watching his head fall back, throat taut and exposed, a groan rumbling deep in his chest. Shh, I whispered, my free hand tracing the sharp line of his jaw, thumb brushing his parted lips. Let me do this for you. My touch stayed light but sure, teasing him toward the edge, his body trembling under my control. His eyes clenched shut, waves of pleasure tightening his grip on the sheets, and I leaned closer, my breath hot against his ear. Lucas, let go. His release hit hard, a violent shudder rocking through him, a hoarse cry breaking the stillness. His fingers found mine, lacing tight as he rode it out, our breaths ragged, sinking in the aftermath. The room fell quiet again, just the rustle of sheets and the clock's soft tick filling the space. Neither of us spoke, caught in the raw swirl of what I'd done, what we'd shared. With a reluctant sigh, I untangled myself, sliding off the bed. The sheet fell away, my silhouette sharp in the moonlight, the silk nightgown clinging to every curve. Lucas's eyes followed me, heavy with satisfaction and a storm of unspoken questions. Why? He rasped, voice thick, barely cutting through the haze. I smoothed the fabric down, meeting his gaze. Couldn't sleep for thinking about you, I said, soft and steady. A confession and a quiet apology rolled into one. Without another word, I turned, slipping out of the room, my footsteps silent on the carpet. His scent lingered on my skin, his taste still sharp in my mind, the sound of his unrestrained groan echoing as I went. Back in my own bed, the sheets cool against my flushed skin, I lay still, heart pounding with a wild mix of guilt and power. What I'd started wasn't just a moment. It was a game, one I'd set the rules for, and I wasn't done playing. The memory of his surrender fueled me, a spark I'd tend until it blazed into something neither of us could turn away from. The night stretched ahead, dark and endless, and I knew morning would bring more than just sunlight. It'd bring the next move, and I'd be ready.